Hey Adventurers, so today is going to be a slightly different type of video. This is more of like a video essay type video where I have thoughts on a specific topic and I'm going to talk about them. And that is, I've titled this video, Redwall Isn't Fantasy. And that title will become clear as I start talking through where this video idea came from. So we'll just get right into it. So this video idea came from a conversation I had with Dom from Dominish Books. He found a comment on a video, I believe it was by Library of a Viking, and I think it was something talking about a top 10 list of greatest fantasy series of all time or something like that, that Library of a Viking Johan had found, and he was doing a video on it. And in that video he mentioned that he was surprised that Redwall wasn't on the list, and I think one of the commenters claimed that why would he be surprised, Redwall's not fantasy. And that Dom saw the comment and he pointed it out to me. And so since then I've been thinking about this topic. I actually primarily wrote this essay in response to Dom being like, do you have any thoughts on this? And so I responded to Dom about it. But I wanted to do a video on it, kind of flesh out my thoughts a little bit more, add in just some more details if they come to me, and we'll see what happens. So that's the background for why this video. And so now you see why it's titled Redwall Isn't Fantasy, and it's basically an argument of, can we even say that Redwall isn't fantasy? So first off, we don't have to prove that it is fantasy. They have to prove that it isn't. That's the first thing. We don't have to, like, we can say something's fantasy and we really don't have to prove that it is. Somebody else, if they're saying something different, they are the ones who need to prove it. So we don't really have to, but I kind of want to look at some proofs anyways, but we'll see what happens. So they have to prove that it isn't fantasy, which they will find very, very hard to do. It is about impossible to prove that something is not fantasy. It'd be far easier to prove that any other genre could be considered fantasy than it would be to say that fantasy is not fantasy. That's kind of a little bit complicated, convoluted, roundabout, but basically what I'm trying to say is that the argument for almost any book to be made as this is fantasy is a lot easier than the argument to be made that something is not. I'll just move on, and I think we'll get back to that in a second here when I talk about some definitions. So secondly, what genre would it belong to if it's not fantasy? Sure, it's action and adventure, and a thriller at times, and contemplative at times, and certainly speculative fiction. But since when does any of those things make something not fantasy? They're called subgenres for a reason. They can exist under the umbrella of fantasy just as easily as quest fantasy, or grimdark, or epic, or any of these other types of fantasies. So, now as to some proofs that it is, one only really has to look at so many of the definitions of fantasy to see the truth of the matter. There's two that I marked down as having liked. I have a dictionary here that I'll pull out and we'll look at some definitions in there. I don't know what it's going to say because I haven't looked in this specific dictionary for that word, but we will look at those definitions as well. So the two that I pulled out as ones I really liked are an imaginative or fanciful work, especially one dealing with supernatural or unnatural events or characters. And then the other one is imagination unrestricted by reality. Redwall has talking animals. Talking animals don't exist there. That makes them unnatural characters. Imagination unrestricted by reality. The reality is that talking animals don't exist. I mean, obviously there's like birds and stuff that can parrot human voices and can try and say, they don't actually speak, they don't really know what they're doing, but they can parrot back. Obviously a parrot is one of them. They can parrot back the sounds that human voices make, and they can remake that same sound. So obviously there's things like that. Yes, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about animals of mice, rabbits, foxes, all of them across the board being able to talk with voices, with the English language, essentially. So that's not reality, so Brian Jakes' imagination is unrestricted by reality, making it fantasy. So let's look at a couple more definitions here. Fantasy. Now written fancy, which let's see. Okay, so it's telling me to look at fancy. So we'll look at fancy real quick. faculty by which the mind forms images or representations of things at pleasure. It is often used as synonymous with imagination, but imagination is rather the power of combining and modifying our conceptions. Here's another definition. An opinion or notion. I have always had a fancy that learning might be made a play and recreation to children. So that's the example. It's a taste, a conception. The little chapel called the Salutation is very neat and built with a pretty fancy. That's another example. Let's see, I'll stop reading the examples. It's an image, conception, thought. Number 5, inclination or liking. Number 6, love. Number 7, caprice, humor, whim. Number 8, false notion. Number 9, something that pleases or entertains without real use or value. That's, I will fight back against the idea that fantasy as literature has no value, because that is also a very common misconception within the literary community. And then we get into fancy as a verb, and I don't feel like I need to look into that. So there's a whole lot of different definitions there that were used. I still like these two that I have written: imaginative or fanciful work, especially when dealing with supernatural or unnatural events or characters. And the other one is imagination unrestricted by reality. So there are several other definitions that continue to explain this. You look in other dictionaries besides this specific one and you'll find other definitions as well. But then we go on to Redwall itself. It is set in its own world, which makes it a high fantasy. It has animals with human characteristics and their own unique societies and social structures, which makes it anthropomorphic fantasy. It has characters being sent on quests to retrieve magical or mystical artifacts and find unique characters or places, making it quest fantasy. So that's just 3 subgenres that it falls into. There's many other subgenres that you could find and apply to this series. But most importantly for fantasy, in my opinion, is it has magic. It has a very soft magic system and does not really include things like blatant in-your-face power blasts or fancy light shows. But it is there. The magic is there. The magic of the world is in many ways subtle and unnoticeable, but it is very much alive. You can read any of the books in the series and find a character being influenced by the spirits of the past. Most of the time it is either Martin the Warrior appearing to a new warrior, or the Badger Lords of old appearing to a new Badger Lord. But in these appearances, they provide knowledge, wisdom, and understanding that the characters could not know. It did not exist during their lives, during the period of seasons that they were alive and now they're dead. So how do they have this information if it's not magic? But still, even if they just appeared, that in and of itself would be magic. But also, there are some shaman-like characters where they read bones, or stones, or leaves, or sticks, or a combination of them all. And there are some with some sorts of healing magic, or even some sleight of hand and bright flashing lights, colors magic. There's really no reason to believe that it's not fantasy. So that's the end of what I had written. I thought that I had sat down and wrote more on this topic. Apparently I have not, but I will talk a little bit about this magic system a little bit more, just to reinforce why I'm saying that it is fantasy. So back at the beginning, in the early days of the channel, Kate and I created a video series that was a 5 elements of story. That was the series that we did, and we focused on these 5 parts of story that we think are very important. And one of those was magic system, which we have now retermed, I guess, as uniqueness factor, that which makes a story unique from one another. Within a fantasy world, it is specifically the magic system. It has to do with what makes this series or book unique from all other books. And in fantasy, it's usually the magic system. So because of that, I want to look through this video and just talk a little bit about how it ties into this idea of Redwall being fantasy or Redwall not being fantasy. So the 3 points that we have is that it needs to exist. It doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be a usable magic system, spells, powers, etc. but there needs to be a magic in the world, whether this is magical creatures or events or usable magic. It just needs to be there. It doesn't even need to be in the forefront of the series, but it needs to somehow influence the world in some way. Maybe not the story, but the world itself. So that is the first point that we made in this video of it needs to exist. So let's apply that to Redwall. Does it exist? Is there a magic system that exists? Yes. It's, as I mentioned, it's the spirits of the ancestors, essentially. The spirits of warriors and important people who are long dead. It's usually Martin the Warrior, sometimes the Badger Lords, sometimes other characters. In Triss, which is the most recent Redwall book that I have read, Triss's father appears to her, alongside Martin the Warrior, but they do appear. So this is still a major part of the world. It exists and it's important, and it affects the story directly, or the characters directly in some way, the world directly in some way. It needs to be unique to the story, and this, I'm not going to read through every single thing that we wrote for the rest of these two, but basically what I'm saying here is it doesn't necessarily have to be something that has never ever been done before. You look at Sanderson's magic systems, and he's done most of his magic systems. You can see influences. Take Hymnology from the Mistborn series. Hymnology is very, very interesting. It's very dark, it's very creepy, it's very weird the way that it works. But it's not completely unique to Sanderson. I have recently read the first 4 books in the Runelord series by David Farland, where they have a magic system that is very similar in many ways to Hymnology. Sanderson wrote his books. In fact, he actually learned from David Farland, and after David Farland's death, he took over that class that David Farland taught at BYU, whatever, I don't remember what that stands for, it's a university. But Sanderson took over that writing class that David Farland taught. And so clearly, Sanderson took some inspiration from that magic system of endowments that is in the Runelord series for his Hymnologic magic system. So, it doesn't have to be unique in that nothing has ever been done exactly like this ever before. It has to be unique in its execution, in the way that it's done, in the way that it's applied. And that's what we see with Redwall. We see ghosts, essentially. But they're ghosts done in a way that is not done in very many other stories, if any at all. And that means it is unique to the story, specifically. And then the third point is it needs to make sense in the world. How does it affect the world? Does it make sense with the way that the world is set up? Yeah, it does. It makes sense with the way that the world is set up. We have these characters who are dead. We don't know of any sort of afterlife. There is no sort of afterlife set up. There is a little bit of one, actually. There is the Gates of the Dark Forest is mentioned a couple times, and there's I think there's a heaven equivalent as well. But there's nothing in the series that implies that there's a god. There's nothing in the series that implies that those in the afterlife can't appear to those in the physical life. So it fits the story, and it fits the world, and it makes sense with the world that is presented. So that's really all that I have to say regarding this magic system. Eventually I will do a more in-depth deep dive on the magic system of Redwall, but I'm going to wait until I have actually read the entire series, because I think there's 2 books, maybe 3 books that I have not read in this series, and there's a lot that I haven't read in long enough that I don't remember anything about the books. So I'm going to completely reread the entire series, which I'm about halfway done with, I believe, and then I will make an in-depth discussion video on the magic system of Redwall. But basically this video was just an examination of, can Redwall be considered fantasy, and if not, why not? And we proved very quickly that it can be considered fantasy, and so it was less of a why should it be considered fantasy, and more of a why can it not be considered not fantasy, if that makes any sense at all. I don't know, I'm kind of, the formatting of this video might be a little bit weird. I don't know exactly how it's going to turn out, but it was a topic that came up that I found very interesting, and that I had some thoughts about, and being kind of one of the only people who seems to be not only have read Redwall but also still be reading Redwall and making content regarding it, it's one that I thought that I was probably the right person to make a video on. There's other people who could do it better, like Caption Awards Jay. I think he would do a phenomenal video series on Redwall, on why you should read Redwall, on the magic system of Redwall, on the world, on the characters, on everything. I think he'd do some great videos if he would do some stuff on Redwall, and I think he's planning to eventually. But seeing as I'm the one reading him, and I'm the one who came across this comment, or was shown this comment, I'll put it that way, it's a video that I thought that I needed to make. So anyways, kind of long, kind of rambly. We'll end it there. Thank you guys for watching an Erudite Adventure. We post videos every Monday and Thursday. We have our social medias linked in the description down below. We will see you guys again soon. Stay warm.